Let's take a look at the code. This is where we're really going to blaze, and then we're going to go do something more interesting. The more interesting for me is persistence, and I think we're not going to get to doing the buttons, but let's do the persistence today because I want to really demonstrate that for people who want to dive into the code. But before we do that, let me just take a look at how this was created. So, table load, you will find a folder called extensions under the basic example. In there, you will find a file called table.
And now, Ed, this is where is this located? This is in the files that they can download, or is this part of SSK?
This is part of what? Yes, this is part of what they can download. It's in the basic folder, in a folder called extensions, and in here you'll find table, string, IO, and display. Now, display was the one I used earlier just to intro us, maybe roughly, into the concept of extending, but all of this example we're doing now relies upon IO, string, and table. And here's the part I want to demonstrate. These all come from SSK. I simply copy them over. So if you want to get the latest and greatest version of these, get SSK, because I'm constantly updating these, and if there's a bug that I find or something that I can do to make it better, I make it better. That said, as I said, this comes from SSK, so there's the SSK statement at the top. I'm not taking that out. First thing it does is it requires the JSON library because I use that for encoding and decoding. I localize the math random just because I use it. Table shuffle, another function that's in here. I'm not going to talk about it. Combine unique. Let's just get down to load. So we'll search for save and load. Here is save. Here's the load. So to create my load function, I simply say function table, which table is a global variable that contains all of the different functions, and I'm not sure if there are any fields on here that are associated with the table library. And I know that there is no table load. Now this is kind of caution for the user. This is one case where I chose not to be safe. In other words, if the guys, Corona staff later on said, hey, we're going to make our own save and load, because this is we can't let Ed have all the glory here. We got to put our own save and load. People need it. Why don't we just put it in there? They could extend table. Problem is, if you load SSK now, I'm going to wipe it out and replace it with my own. But I'm happy with that because I know how mine works. So
it's worth noting though, you could still put in a line of code that says, table.load 0 equals table.load.
Yeah, I used to.
And you're future-proof in that sense.
I took it out. There used to be, you're absolutely right. SSK used to have a tester in this file that would check to see if it needed to be replaced. I finally said, you know what? I'm just going to keep my own. I'm not going to be safe anymore. So table load takes a file name and a base directory. We pointed this out earlier where by default it's the documents directory, but I could have put system temporary or system resource directory to load out of the resource directory, for example. I use an existing function in the system library to convert this file name into a full path, and then I pass that into IO open. I locate it, I get the file handle, that is I open the file, and let's see. The big magic here is I read the contents of the file right here into a temporary or a local variable. I close the file just to be clean, and then I decode what was in there, so contents, and I put it in new table, and then I simply return it. So if anything goes wrong up to this point, what I'm going to return is nil. Or, if I couldn't open the file, I return nil. I could have probably just done this. I'm not going to do it. So, let's take a look at the dumping function, because we used it. And this is the reason why IO and string are in here. I would not have included IO or string, but I very, very much wanted to use the function for dumping out the contents of the table. However, as you can see, the dumping function is a lot more complicated, and it uses extensions to the string library. It uses a padding extension to the string library, and I think I skipped over it. Did I use IO exists?
So basically, these are just the dependencies
Yeah.
for that. Okay.
So these are included. IO and string libraries are included purely because the table library uses some of my extensions. If I didn't include them, it would not work. But the key values, the key functions you probably want to look at so far are load. It's a very simple function, but you can see it's like, I don't know, 15 lines of code. And save. And save is like 10 lines of code. So you can write this 10 times, or you could write it once by doing an extension. So let's talk about persistence, which is the next example. What is persistence? Let me bring up the code in the example. Persistence, yes. Got to make sure I got the right one. And okay, so what is persistence? Persistence is basically we've already done it. We've created some data that we store on the disk and we restore it later. But one of the things that is missing out of that equation is ideally you can set up some default values. But how do you go about that? One way to do it is in your code, you could load the table and then you could look for every field where you want a default value and you could set it and then save it. But that seems kind of wasteful to me. I thought, why? I used to do that all the time. I would write my code where I used my own load and save, and I would write a function that would check to see, is this value set? Is this value set? If it's not set, set it to this value and save it. And I finally said, wait, Mr. Lazy, you're not even following your own maxim here. So I wrote another library called persist, which is also part of SSK. And all it did was it used my extensions to the table library and it added a little more functionality. And the way it works is if you look in folder 2, this is what we're looking at now, 2 persistence, you'll see that it contains a main.lua and a init.lua and then 2 files called test1 and 2. It's also got the other build settings and stuff, but those are not related to the example in the sense of what we're trying to discuss. So what does this main Lua do? I do my normal stuff. I get rid of the status bar. I set the buffering the way I like it. I set a variable that's used by SSK for the default game font. And then I load SSK. So this example uses the entire SSK library. I'm too lazy to separate out the bits for you this time. Sorry. So everything in SSK comes for the ride.
Which I was looking at the folder for SSK, and it's only what 566K. So.
Yeah, actually, I thank you for pointing that out. I'll show you something cool about SSK for those who want to know it in the future. It's useful to people who are saying, well, this thing is too big. Okay, so but before I run it the first time, let me. I'm not going to be able to do it. Oh, where is it? I'm trying to locate the sandbox. Okay, forget it. I should have had the sandbox open already. Just trust me that there's nothing in the sandbox right now. So we looked at it on the last example. I'm going to save to the documents folder. There's nothing in there. The problem is because I don't have it loaded, I can't locate it with the file open sandbox. So what do I do here? Line 9 requires the init Lua file, which I just pointed out exists. And in there, what I do is I localize the persist library. So SSK, one thing that I didn't mention before, is SSK is basically a table, and then it's got a bunch of references to sublibraries. So it's like a super library, where SSK is the root, and then persist is its own library, and then I've got an SSK display, which is a library of display extensions and display functions that I've added. So if you were to dump out the contents of SSK, you would see a bunch of tables, which are each of themselves modules or libraries. So as I said, SSK is like a super library containing a bunch of sublibraries. So one thing I like to do in my code is instead of constantly saying ssk.persist.do this, whatever, I say, well, I just want the library. So ssk persist, put it in a local variable, and this is called localization. And now if I want to call the set default function, which is part of the persist library, I simply say persist set default. And so that's what this function is doing, is I'm setting up the defaults. I create a module, I add a function called run. I could have called it anything. And then in here I do 3 set defaults. I say set default, and the name of the file that I'm going to be saving this in is JSON, settings.json. I want a field called volume, and if it doesn't exist, it isn't set yet, I want it to be set to 0.5. I want to give them 100 coins, and I want to make the email, these are just random things I made up.
Now
this email, Bob at fake email.
This is another case where you've got one line of code, but underneath that is the logic to say if it's not set, right?
Right. So the logic behind this does all that. It says, does the file exist? Oh, the file doesn't exist. I need to create it. Does the setting exist? The setting doesn't exist. I need to create that. But it's a little smarter than that.